Oh, it's so much fun to watch when it's a tightly contested championship, whether that's constructors or drivers. It feels like even though it's just been a handful of races, that maybe Lewis Hamilton's decision has been proved right. Maybe he knew something that we didn't, Nathaniel.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it does seem like Lewis has kind of phoned it in, doesn't it, a little bit? Because I don't think the start of the season, he's been pretty poor. I mean, I think he's got away with it in the sense of you think about how we usually talk about drivers that aren't delivering. I don't know whether Lewis is just like his head's already in 2025, but yeah, that was the big talking point, wasn't it? When Lewis did make that switch, we said, well, what does this mean about where he sees both teams, both projects, etc. And I think it speaks to exactly what Laurence just laid out there about the team. The feel around Ferrari is much better. They're clearly doing a lot of things differently. And Mercedes, I just don't know. Like you don't get a few years ago, the last 2022 and 2023, the feeling was Mercedes have just made a slight misstep, but it's put them here. As soon as they get it right, they'll be right back on the tail of Red Bull. This year, I don't think anybody's thinking that. I don't think anyone's like, oh, Mercedes are right there, and they're just a little step away. Everyone's like, okay, Mercedes are just in that group behind now, and to fall away like that is pretty significant. So yeah, it's obviously too early to say Mercedes. You never write them off improving through a season, but yeah, I just think Ferrari right now look like such a better package, just all round. Um, the weirdest thing to me, then the funniest thing to me I think Lewis Hamilton is definitely an upgrade on most drivers, in Formula One. Depends which Lewis you're getting. I mean, I'm not sure whether Lewis has just turned his attention elsewhere. There's some people saying maybe Lewis just isn't the same driver he was a few years ago, which I think is harsh because he was good last season. But the weirdest thing about all this is that at the moment it looks like Ferrari have replaced a very, they're very, very good driver in Carlos Sainz, their most informed driver in Carlos Sainz with obviously with the greatest statistical driver of all time. And I wonder how that dynamic is going to change things going forward because I think Lewis is going to be a lot more demanding on the team than Carlos may well be. But yeah, I think he's definitely he can be very pleased with himself making that decision. Because if you were putting money on either team beating Red Bull, like who the first team to beat Red Bull will be, I
With
think you
Ferrari.
go Ferrari, and I don't even think you say Mercedes. I think you put McLaren above Mercedes right
Agreed.
now, just given what we've seen from them from the past kind of 12 months or so. Yeah, Mercedes, I wouldn't put up there. You might even stick Aston Martin around Mercedes, just given the investment, given the ambition of Lawrence Stroll. With Mercedes, we've just kind of seen them stagnate. So I think that Lewis, it does feel like he's abandoning ship a little bit. And yeah, it's funny, isn't it, how decisions in hindsight always just look so different in Formula One. You can make a decision in January, and then even by April, we're like, yeah, Lewis is a genius. He's made this great decision. By
We'll
August,
see.
we might be saying, what's he doing?
Oh, yeah,
Mercedes is
exactly.
now amazing again. But right now, yeah, in the cold light of day, it does look like there was a lot of logic behind what he decided to do.
Mate,
What
I don't
is a
want to
real
let that slide there. Sorry, Katie, can I just jump in? Because it sounded a bit like, Nate, you were saying that you would pick Carlos Sainz over Lewis Hamilton for
Oh no, no,
2025.
no.
Is that what you were saying?
No, 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 no. I was just saying it's interesting that right now one of the things that's standing out for me about Ferrari is how good Carlos Sainz is performing, and yet he's moving on. So I think that I would pick Lewis over Carlos any day of the week. But I think one of the things that certainly I think especially in those moments when Red Bull have slipped up, it's been Carlos, not Charles Leclerc, who's jumped into that, and has capitalized. And it's just interesting that he's the guy who's making way now, not Charles, or not any, not there's like a third driver's seat like there would be in WEC. Lewis, 100% of the time, I would pick over Carlos. But that dynamic of that team and what Carlos has brought to the table, and given the fact that Lewis is we've been quite underwhelming this season, it's just that part of it. It's just quite interesting going into next year because I 100% think Lewis will be back on form. But if you looked at it in the cold light of day right now, you're like, what, is Lewis just washed up at this point? Is he, there's lots of people saying that at the moment, and I don't agree with it. But I just thought it was interesting, Carlos winning in Singapore last year, winning in Australia, and yet he's the guy that doesn't have a race seat yet for next season. And it's probably been one of the standout good points for Ferrari for a little while now, I'd say. Leclerc's been great as well, but I think he's not stepped up when he's needed to. Maybe I'm not making any sense. So, in my head, I'm
do
making
you
sense, but
do you
the way
accept
Lawrence
Lawrence
is looking at me
that
is
rebuttal? I know he's smirking.
He's smirking like,
No, I think that's a very fair point, and I think it's a nuanced point, and you're right, it is.
yeah,
And it's clear that the two Ferrari drivers right now have quite different strengths, and which one would you back? Because you've got Carlos Sainz, as you say, so consistent, able to pick up race victories, it seems, when Red Bull have the issues, but you have Leclerc's raw pace that sometimes goes awry, sometimes it doesn't quite materialize, but when it does, it's explosive. It's, you know, it makes Carlos look quite average. So that is a really tricky decision. I agree for Ferrari. It's too late now because decision's been made. My gut feeling is that it is the right one. That, you know, Lewis and Charles will be a better pairing than, say, Lewis and Carlos or Charles and Carlos. But yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation to have. That's why I just wanted to pick it up, because I want to clarify exactly which way you were going with that, because it's such an interesting conversation.
yeah, and you're right too as well. And actually, this is where, you know, the Charles Leclerc conversation is actually quite interesting, because when they made that move, obviously we were talking about how great it is. Lewis is going to Ferrari, but there's always been part of me that has felt that fundamentally that decision to get Lewis in was not exactly. It's never been a ringing endorsement of what Ferrari think about Charles Leclerc, in the sense of, if you thought he's the guy that when you have a car that can deliver, you're like, look, let's go get a Ricardo or a I don't know, an Albon. You know, let's go get another talented young driver who we don't have to pay as much money, who'll be competitive and maybe well be on the same level as Charles, but we'll build the team around him. Now, obviously, if Lewis Hamilton is available to you, you probably go after him. It's a bit like Mercedes with Max right now, you know, keeping that door open, etc. But I always saw it as, you know, John Elkann, from what we understand, you know, President of Ferrari has said, or sorry, CEO at Ferrari has said, we need a top line driver, we need a superstar driver. And a lot of people would say, well, don't you already have that in Charles Leclerc? And the fact that Ferrari went after Lewis, I think, spoke volumes to the way they viewed both drivers. Maybe that they had two good drivers, but maybe not great drivers, or at least consistently great drivers. So it's interesting that they brought in Lewis. To me, it wasn't exactly a great sign of how they saw Charles Leclerc. And now what we're seeing, to add to that nuanced point that we've been talking about, Carlos seems to be the one who's just in those big moments is getting more out of the car. I think Charles Leclerc is a fantastic driver, but yeah, the question that is growing around him is, when those opportunities present themselves, is he the right person? You know, and does he have the, you know, the right pace, the right temperament, etc., the right coolness under pressure to deliver? And at the moment, he's not. It's Sainz in that car who is the guy to do that.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.